Dzień dobry. Słuchacie Państwo podcastu Polityki Insight, platformy wiedzy dla liderów polityki i biznesu. Co tydzień nasi eksperci omawiają najważniejsze wydarzenia polityczne i gospodarcze, analizują krajowe, europejskie i globalne trendy. Ja nazywam się Marek Świerczyński i w Polityce Insight prowadzę dział bezpieczeństwa i spraw międzynarodowych. Zapraszam na kolejny odcinek naszego podcastu. Jest wtorek, 9 marca. W specjalnym obronnym wydaniu podcastu Polityki Insight wita Marek Świerczyński. Dzisiaj proponuję bliższe spojrzenie na transatlantyckie, natowskie i inne związane z bezpieczeństwem priorytety nowej amerykańskiej administracji, a także rzadko opisywane, a bardzo ciekawe poczynania NATO na wschodniej flance sojuszu. Na początek będę rozmawiał z kanadyjskim ekspertem zajmującym się NATO, również dlatego, by pokazać perspektywę sojuszników innych niż tylko Amerykanie. Z kolei o sojuszniczych ćwiczeniach w krajach bałtyckich opowie mi niemiecki oficer sił powietrznych. Zrobi się więc naprawdę międzynarodowo. Moim pierwszym gościem jest dr Alexander Lanoszka, kanadyjski naukowiec i badacz młodego pokolenia, obecnie wykładowca Uniwersytetu Waterloo w Ontario. Dr Lanoszka ma doktorat z amerykańskiego Princeton, pracował później na uczelniach w Stanach, Wielkiej Brytanii i Kanadzie, ale jak sam pisze, za swój dom uważa 2 miejsca na świecie, rodzinne miasto Windsor, Detroit i Kraków. Stąd pochodzi jego rodzina. Z tej racji dr Lanoszka bacznie przygląda się polskiej polityce obronnej z perspektywy sojuszniczej, i dlatego zgodził się opowiedzieć, jak będzie to wyglądać po zmianie w Białym Domu. Ponieważ językiem, w którym mój rozmówca pracuje i pisze, jest angielski, w tym języku będziemy też rozmawiać, ale przynajmniej na powitanie niech mi wolno będzie użyć polskiego. Olek, witam Cię w podcaście Polityki Insight.
Dzień dobry, dziękuję bardzo.
So, we're going to talk in English about the transition from Trump to Biden in the background of defense and security policy, also in its NATO-allied dimension. I've seen that one of your recent publications was just about that. I mean, how was the Polish-US defense cooperation under Trump? Can you tell me how it will develop under Biden?
Well, so as you know, Biden campaigned and has since, as president, affirmed his interest in reinvigorating the NATO alliance. Certainly, he may just as well be the most transatlantic president that the United States has had since George H.W. Bush. And so in that particular sense, I think the news is rather good because he will certainly see more stability in the ranks of NATO, at least in the political dimension. To be sure, I don't want to overstate the change. I think one of the more puzzling or paradoxical attributes of the Trump years with regards to its unique style of alliance management has been that the military-to-military cooperation was rather good, even within NATO. It was really at the political level where things got a little testy. But at the military level, we saw much cooperation, and I don't foresee that changing necessarily over the course of the next few years. It may just as well be better because there will not be so much uncertainty over whether the United States truly is as committed to Article 5 and so forth as what had been the case with Trump. On the political side, things are going to be a little more interesting for Poland because, of course, the peace government had rather aligned itself fairly strongly with the Trump administration for a number of reasons. To be sure, Poland was not unique in that regard. Many countries believed that the best way to manage Trump was not actually to move away from Trump, but actually to get closer. Japan also did a similar thing too. But of course, with the way that the government has positioned itself vis-a-vis the Republican Party in the United States, especially in the last presidential election in Poland, there could be some degree of aloofness from the White House towards Duda or other members of the Polish government. That might not necessarily affect military-to-military relations whatsoever, though.
It is also my impression that despite the harsh rhetoric, the unfriendliness of Mr. Trump towards NATO and towards some key European allies, the military-to-military cooperation was actually expanding during his tenure rather than being reduced. We see a little bit of change as we speak, actually. But of course, in terms of the rhetoric, we see a great opening. We've seen that in the speeches that Mr. Biden gave to the Munich conference. We've seen that during NATO ministerial session with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. We've seen that during the G7 and the E3 formats that were both used to communicate this new opening. What do we know? What do you read from what has been said?
Well, like I said, I think there's this bigger question as to whether the rhetoric really truly matters, right? We saw in the Trump years that there are certain limits to how much we should care about rhetoric. If we took for granted that rhetoric was the only thing that mattered, then we would have a very different picture of NATO, and we would ignore so much of what was happening on the operational side of things, which some would argue, including yours truly, that those are the things that really matter because those are more costly, those entail actual resources, those are decisions that have some weight, much more than what a certain speech may convey, as important that speech may be. And some of even the rhetoric from the Trump administration was not necessarily a bad thing, even if it was critical of certain parts of NATO, insofar as it may have stimulated greater effort by European countries to spend more on their militaries. So certainly the change in rhetoric is to be welcome from the Biden administration, but that should not obscure some of these deeper continuities that we're going to see on their operational side, just as much as there were deeper continuities that marked the transition between Obama and Trump themselves. But again, I still think there are certain issues that are going to remain very salient in the transatlantic relationship, regardless of how Joe Biden passes himself off as a champion of NATO and so forth. I think there'll still be some deeper skepticism of Germany on certain issues that might be problematic. There will still be this insistence on the part of the Pentagon and the White House to see European countries bear more of the conventional defense burden. Some of that might eventually turn into harsher rhetoric if there's a perception in Washington, D.C. that all this goodwill that have come up with the new administration has really turned out for naught in terms of actual defense spending. This might be just as more acute in the post-COVID-19 era. And certainly in the run-up to the to the inauguration of Joe Biden, there were still a number of concerns about the European Union's interest in negotiating a comprehensive agreement on investment, which, as you know, complicates matters in terms of forging an anti-Chinese coalition of sorts that even Joe Biden wishes to do, not unlike his predecessor. So there are still going to be certain issues that reflect deeper continuities in international politics, more than just what the rhetoric of any particular administrative official can convey.
So let's have a closer look at these facts on the table, despite the rhetorics. First, the global posture review. It was sort of communicated in a way that may have eased any anxieties on the European side, because it was sold as halting the decision by Mr. Trump to withdraw or reduce the contingent in Germany. But on the other hand, it is still ongoing, and we may end up having the forces relocated within European theater. To a certain degree, we already see it, maybe not in terms of relocation, but in terms of adding, for instance, the African direction to what the US Army Europe/Africa now is doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's become this article of faith that, at least since the 2000s, U.S. foreign policy has been shifting away from Europe and more towards the Indo-Pacific region in terms of resources and strategic attention. And I would argue that this is a bit overstated, because the United States, at least in 2021, is more involved in European security affairs than, at least since the 1990s, when the Yugoslav wars were taking place. Crimea, of course, reversed trends. So much so that Trump ended up being the first post-Cold War president not to remove troops from Europe. That's largely because of a unique combination of domestic, political, and alliance factors. There is still a lot of bipartisan support for Europe in the United States, despite some of the rhetoric that we might have seen. Now, how does this all matter with respect to the global posture review? I think we can identify two key trends, or at least with respect to how the United States has been structuring its forces abroad. Firstly, it has been indeed pulling out forces from Europe. Every American president, with the exception of Donald Trump, has done that, as I just mentioned. That does not necessarily mean putting more troops into East Asia. That does not logically follow, in part because of how military technology develops, but that's just the way it is. The other trend is that there is this growing emphasis on agility, on versatility, on flexibility. Every quadrennial defense review, a defense review published every 4 years by the Department of Defense, emphasizes in how the United States should move away from big bases to more flexible rotational deployments. And I think we see some of these trends reflected in the proposal put forward by the Trump administration in the summer of 2020 as regards to that military drawdown from Germany that you mentioned. So there's much that is consistent, as a matter of fact, between what we see since 1990 and what we saw last year. Of course, I think there was a deeper issue about consultations. There were no consultations. Everyone was sort of taken up by surprise. And I think there's also this other philosophical question with which the Department of Defense needs to wrestle, and that is the assurance role that these rotational deployments have in bolstering the sense of security, at least, of some of NATO's newer members, including, of course, Poland. So certainly the attraction of these rotational deployments is that they're flexible. You can put them in different places so long as the host nation wants them and has some infrastructure to support them. But precisely because they're rotational, there's this sense of impermanence that they could just as well be withdrawn. But unfortunately, that is the model that the Pentagon has embraced. And I think even with the Biden administration, there'll still be this desire to embrace flexible rotational deployments rather than even small permanent deployments, even though those might make more sense from an assurance perspective or even from a deterrence perspective.
You've just disclosed your views, actually, because, correct me if I'm wrong, you were advocating putting more permanent troops on NATO's eastern flank, including Poland.
I have made that argument, and I think there are a number of reasons in support of that argument. Obviously, there are reasonable disagreements we can have here. Rotational forces are flexible, and for that reason, they may be politically desirable. They're not necessarily cheaper. They're not necessarily as well manned or well staffed as permanently deployed forces. Some would even argue, as John Denny has, that actually over the long run, they're even more expensive. So from a financial perspective, they might not necessarily make as much sense as you might think. From a political or strategic perspective, if the reassurance signal is simply undercut because everyone expects these to go away, they lack that permanency, as I mentioned, then the general sense of unease may still exist and you're still wrestling with the same problems. Whereas if you have permanently deployed forces, you don't have to have large numbers of them because we're not in the Cold War anymore. We're not going to fight the sort of wars that defense planners in the 1950s envisioned. It's just not that environment anymore. But certainly if you have at least small numbers of dispersed, permanently deployed forces, they might have extra reassurance value. They might actually be able to train more consistently with host nation units. They don't have to tire up those host nation units, as may be the case with the enhanced forward presence in the Baltic countries, where the training is happening at a very high operational tempo. By being there, by having families there, they tend to gain much more familiarity. And so if you're concerned, as some are in the United States, of being entrapped by allies who are up to no good, then actually having permanently deployed forces gives you eyes on the ground on a more regular basis to understand exactly what is happening in the host nation's politics, to develop those relationships with members of the host nation's own armed forces so that you can have new channels to engage in alliance restraint to prevent those things like entrapment from even happening in the first place.
Just to end this thread, as you know, Poland and the United States have signed a bilateral agreement about enhancing the U.S. presence. Do you expect the Biden administration to totally fulfill it in the coming years?
I think so. I think what we're seeing from the Biden administration is some of the things you would expect from any Democratic administration that follows a Republican one. 12 years ago, The Democratic president at the time was saying, all these things about reinvigorating NATO, but at the same time, there was also this general desire to reestablish goodwill with potential adversaries. The reset with Russia comes to mind. There's just no such appetite right now. In fact, I think it is fair to say that Joe Biden is very skeptical of Russia. And as much as he's open to certain forms of cooperation, as signaled by his intent to, or his decision to renew the New START treaty for another 5 years, there's this general sense all the same that Russia is, at least under Putin, is a bad actor, and that defense and deterrence measures need to remain in place. So as regards to that agreement, as much as it was negotiated by the previous administration, this is one I don't think will see any adverse changes taking place. I think the Biden administration is interested, certainly, in solidifying defense and deterrence measures within the alliance in cooperation, of course, with European partners. That enhanced defense cooperation agreements is a step in that direction. I just don't see them turning back on that.
Let's have a look at some other issues between the US and Europe, and a major one, which is burden sharing or defense spending, or actually contribution to the common defense, because it sort of changes its name. We didn't see much pressure, at least in rhetorics, about the 2%. And that's a change between Trump and Biden. On the other hand, while the US is still struggling what to do with Afghanistan deployment, it clearly is in the process of withdrawing its forces from places where it operated for the good, 10 years or more with NATO. Therefore, putting more burden on the rest of the alliance.
Right. This goes to the larger point that sometimes rhetoric does not matter as much, because it's not just in Afghanistan. At the NATO Defense Ministerial, there was an agreement to increase the presence on the part of the alliance from 500 to 4,000 military personnel there. And entirely clear where those numbers are going to come from. Canada itself might be asked to contribute more, and that might raise some uncomfortable debates in this country.
In Poland too.
And in Poland as well. But the issue of burden sharing is an interesting one, and I don't really know how to make sense of it myself. I have seen, as you have, that there has been this relaxed posture, as it were, with regards to how much emphasis should be put on the 2%. Now, this was a transatlantic construct forged a number of years ago, and countries have made that pledge. And so it's not unreasonable to hope and to expect those countries to abide by those pledges. And as you know, there's a certain cohort of countries within NATO that do, and there's a certain cohort that does not. I take the view that the 2% rule is a bit silly. I understand why it's being used. It's a heuristic, meaning it's a shortcut for how to think about whether a country is contributing a fair share to the common defense burden. But the thing is that it's not entirely clear whether, if everyone spends 2%, the entire continent will be secure, because you can imagine there might be some rivalries that might develop. This is obviously an alliance buttressed by nuclear weapons, especially those of the United States, but to a lesser extent, Great Britain, and to an even lesser extent, France. So if the object is collective security in a nuclear environment, 2% spending on the part of each member doesn't necessarily add up to the thing that everyone wants to have. And so it's a little more complicated than that figure suggests.
But we can see the debate changing tone and language from percentage points to capabilities, which is good.
I think that's a healthy way of thinking about it. The problem is that as much as I'm critical of the 2% doctrine for the reasons that I mentioned, and I think, as you just pointed out, that it is worthwhile to look more at the contributions that individual countries are making to specific missions, like in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or even the enhanced foreign presence. The 2% guideline does in some ways keep countries honest, and it does obligate them to take their defense portfolios seriously, such that they achieve some level of operational readiness, right? In the case of Germany, this is the big problem, I think. And it's also true even of Canada. One could say it's probably even more of a problem with Canada. But with respect to Germany...
You are below 2%, just to clarify it for our...
Yeah, so both Germany and Canada spend about 1.4, 1.5%. The numbers have obviously changed because COVID has flipped everything around. But either case, with respect to Germany and Canada, we see staggeringly low levels of operational readiness. As you know, there was that Bundestag report that painted a very grim picture as to how many capabilities Germany can actually bring to bear in any given moment. It's usually a small fraction. That's unacceptable. And that is going to be a source of tension even with the Biden administration. So the 2% guideline may very well be silly for the reasons that we've discussed. But if nothing else, like I said, it still provides that shortcut to how to think about these sorts of problems. And with respect to operational readiness, one can think that maybe more money will buy some of that readiness. But of course, we know that the relationship between spending money and actually having tangible results out of your military are completely different matters.
What is the Canadian point of view, I wonder, on the next big issue that is China? I mean, China is on everybody's mind now. It has been, under tremendous scrutiny due to COVID, etc. And of course, you can see this continuity in the US strategy by the fact that Biden has named it the greatest problem and is doing numerous reports about how to cut dependencies, deal with it militarily, deal with it diplomatically in the first place. And since I have you a representative of a significant but non-prime tier ally, I wonder what is the point of view of Canada on that?
Canada is a strange country in this regard. So Canada is surrounded by 3 oceans and has the United States to its south. It has a large population on the Pacific Ocean, right, with Vancouver being a major city. And yet, as much as we can maybe even imagine ourselves to be a Pacific country in this regard, the predilection on the part of political leaders in Ottawa has been eastwards. That is to say that the preoccupation has been steadfastly transatlantic. There is this strong impulse to look at security problems through a transatlantic lens. And that is one of the reasons why Canada is fairly involved in Europe these days, much more than even most Canadians realize. Right now, Canada is a framework nation in Latvia with over 550 military personnel, working alongside, of course, the Poles who are contributing to that battle group. In fact, the second largest European diplomatic presence after London is in Riga. It's contributed recently to the enhanced air policing mission in Romania. Over 1,000 Canadian soldiers have taken part in exercises in the Dravsko-Pomorskie even. So there has been this strong inclination on the part of Canada to be involved in transatlantic issues. With respect to the West Pacific, there's just no such inclination whatsoever. And maybe that's partly a result of Canada's own political history, how so much of the political center is concentrated in the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, which have very strong Anglo or French ties. But to answer your question more directly, there has been a lot of hesitation on the part of Canadian leaders to pivot to East Asia. One is, again, because of this strong inclination to work within a transatlantic framework. And that is one that's just deeply ingrained in the Canadian body politic. The other, more cynical interpretation is that there is this unwillingness to anger Chinese investors. Canada depends so much on international trade for its own wealth. In fact, I think about over a third of Canada's gross domestic product is due to international trade, and about 3/4 of that international trade are with the United States. So there's going to be a strong interest to diversify that trade so as not to become too dependent on any one country, especially when you have the United States to the south. Britain is the biggest European trading partner on the part of Canada, by the way. But China obviously is very enticing because it provides these sorts of opportunities. And so even with the previous government that was in power in Canada, although it started off with expressions of anti-Chinese rhetoric or anti-communist rhetoric, directed, of course, at the authorities in Beijing, it ended up softening its stance in order to provide a much more welcoming business environment or be a much more welcoming business partner. The current government is finding itself in a similar predicament. Just this week, the Canadian House of Commons voted unanimously to pass a motion labeling the activities in Xinjiang as a genocide directed against the Uyghur population there. The vote was unanimous. However, the Prime Minister and his cabinet abstained from that vote. The Trudeau government has also been having to deal with some of the political fallout that has attended the decision to arrest the Huawei chief financial officer, I believe. And it's just not sure what to do with that hot potato. And there's been a lot of nervousness to accuse China of particularly bad behaviors, even though at this moment, there are two Canadians, the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Blanking, unfortunately, who are in captivity. Even though Canada recently signed a multilateral statement or memorandum decrying kidnapping, in effect, it has issued any direct mention of China, despite the fact that there are two Canadians literally in arbitrary detention right now. So Canada has to ask itself of these questions. It's very much stuck in a transatlantic mindset, for better or for worse. But as the United States is going to be pivoting more and more towards the Indo-Pacific, it has to sort of loosen its thinking a little bit more and be a bit more risk accepting, because this is a situation where something just has to give.
I guess many countries will have the same things to think over, the same kind of approaches. Good to have the Canadian perspective. Good to have you with us, Dr. Alexander Lanoszka. Thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękuję.
W drugiej części podcastu rozmawiam z podpułkownikiem Andreasem Kaukelem, zastępcą szefa Centrum Koordynacji Operacji Powietrznych Wielonarodowego Korpusu Północno-Wschodniego NATO w Szczecinie. Pułkownik Kaukel będzie opowiadać o kończącym się ćwiczeniu Furious Wolf, w zasadzie jego drugiej zimowej edycji. Furious Wolf rozgrywa się na poligonach Litwy i Estonii, a polega na integracji sił powietrznych z działającymi na lądzie kontrolerami naprowadzania uzbrojenia, tak zwanymi JTAC-ami. Celem jest więc doskonalenie wsparcia z powietrza dla działań wojsk lądowych. Jak się to robi, po co i dlaczego demonstracja takich zdolności jest szczególnie ważna dla wojsk NATO rozmieszczonych u granic Rosji, o to wszystko zapytam już za chwilę. My guest today is Lieutenant Colonel Andreas Kaukel, who is Deputy Chief of the Air Operations Coordination Center at the Multinational Corps Northeast in Szczecin. And he is with us to tell us about the exercise Furious Wolf 21, which is happening as we speak in the airspace and on the ground of the Baltic states, a little bit of Poland perhaps, and of course the Baltic Sea region. So, Colonel Kaukel, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I would like to ask you about the exercise. I understand this is happening only for the second time in this region at this level, in this shape and form. The first one was late summer 2020. And, a few months later, you are doing this in winter. But I will let you speak about the exercise.
Well, you're absolutely right. This is the second time that we are executing this exercise, Brilliant Wolf. And why is it the second time and so short after the other? Well, not really short, because it takes some time to get the exercise going. And the main part of this exercise was that it is a bottom-up approach. So it is not meant from the higher strategic level or operational level to exercise this. No, it was one of the main issues, or the main frames were actually from the battle groups itself to train their forward air controllers or their JTACs. And that's how we got into a dialogue and say, okay, how can we use air assets and JTACs on the ground in a more compressed way? And so this exercise was first started last year with a lot of very good lessons learned or lessons identified. And then we said, okay, let's keep this going. This is a very good exercise where air and land can operate and train. And so we said, okay, let's do it again for the next year and optimize.
This is a very interesting story. I mean, how did we actually come to doing this exercise last year and now? Because the picture we've got about the eastern flank military allied presence is that we've got the EFP battalion groups, multinational combat groups, and we've got the Baltic air policing in the Baltic states, and we've got some maritime activity, including the standing maritime groups of NATO and the Baltops annual exercise. And then from time to time, we have a combined exercise that involve both land forces, air forces, and maritime forces. And I think from what you've said is that the idea of this exercise is to have something that combines air and land combat capabilities happening very regularly.
That hits the spot, actually. So this integration between air and land is very important because in a future fight, one cannot do without the other. So the land domain will not achieve their objectives if the air does not provide certain things. And so with this exercise, we have to understand that the air-land integration is going on all the time in this region. But it is then with only maybe one EFP battle group, and then it's with another EFP battle group. So it's very selective. So the thought behind this Furious Wolf exercise was, let's pool the players on the ground together. Okay, first 2 weeks in Lithuania and then 2 weeks in Estonia. And then pool those forward air controls together to get the maximum training. Because now if you have multiple nations, they can learn from each other. They can see how things are done and even train as they do it. There's always the very qualified, most capable JTACs that are now making sure that their knowledge is transcending down to the ones that are the trainees. And the same thing happens in the air as well. Everything has to be trained. So even just because you're flying the aircraft doesn't mean you know everything. So it's a stepping stone, and it's started last year slowly. Okay. And now we're getting more confident and we are moving ahead.
Tell us about the challenges in the multinational coordination of the troops on the ground, and I presume also those pilots up in the air.
But there's always challenges. And foremost, I think it is a language barrier, if you don't think it is. Everything is standardized. So all the radio calls, the way that we communicate with each other is standardized. However, if you have an Estonian forward air controller and you have a, let's say, Italian pilot, okay, they might not understand each other on the first try.
Even though they both speak English language.
Absolutely. The English language is the language that is spoken, obviously. But again, that's actually a good thing because now we need to know how to really be focused and adhere by the standards. If you start veering off the standards, then it might not be understood. And that is exactly the point of this whole exercise, is using standards to train the things that we have to do. And maybe those standards are not good enough and we need to broaden them and make them better.
So it's also lessons learned.
Absolutely.
As from any exercise. Walk us through the two roles, or maybe even more roles, that are important in this exercise and in execution of the task. That is the role of the pilot, the role of the JTAC, and whatever happens between them.
Well, nothing happens without briefings. So on the ground, and we say at 1G, is that what we say as pilots, because you're standing on the ground, nothing is moving. That's where you can actually now, in briefings, clarify exactly what is going to happen. So beforehand, okay, I have the JTACs know exactly, okay, there's going to be 2 aircraft, okay, and this aircraft is going to be a Eurofighter, and I know exactly the way that it looks, okay, and what the capabilities are. And the pilots know, okay, I'm going to have 2 or 3 JTACs, and the target is going to be on a certain range within Lithuania or Estonia. It's not somewhere in the open. No, it's on a range complex, which is where there's safety environments, where aircrafts are flying. The airspace where the aircrafts are flying is booked, so it's available for the aircraft and we're the only ones in. So it's also a lot of safety issues come into play. And that's all coordinated ahead of time. So once it comes to, let's say, today we had our first mission. I'm very excited that we've already had a mission with Furious Wolf today. So they coordinate this morning before they actually then fly. Depends, maybe, 2-3 hours. Don't quote me on the hours, but so they come together, they brief, okay, what to expect, and then they fly. So the aircraft flies, takes off, and the ground controllers or the JFACs are going into their area and wait until the aircraft checks in.
Do they operate from the airfields in the area, from Shaolai or Amari or whatever?
Yes, they do. From there on, they take off. The JTACs are now in the range complex. And then obviously the aircraft has to pass through a lot of different airspaces. So he will report to the airspace what he wants to do. And then at one point, he's on the range with the range controller and then is, as we say, pushed over to the JTAC, which then actually controls him and say, okay. And it gives him all the different details. These are the friendly, these are the enemy, this is your target. And then he speaks with him. And that is the most crucial part between the air and land, that the guys on the ground now are trying to paint a picture for the pilot. Because living in a 2-dimension, you see forests and you see houses, but you can't see beyond that. On the 3-dimension, if you fly, everything looks different. I'll give you an example. For instance, if you're flying, and this is from my own personal experience, flying a close air support mission, which that is how it's called, between the JTAC and the airplane. So you start marshalling a holding pattern until you receive all the different informations from the JTAC. And he will tell you there's a certain measurement, okay, saying that's 1 unit. And he says, do you see this road, which has a Y in the road? And you look, okay, yeah, I see that. And it's always confirmed. Yes, I do. And then, okay, from there, go to the north about a half a mile or so. And do you see this? Yes, I see that. Okay, that's 1 unit. So with this, he tells the pilot, whatever I tell you 1 unit, this is what you're going to take. Because the JTAC on the ground might not know how high the aircraft is. If you're very low, in 2,000 or 3,000 feet, this distance is much bigger than if you're at 20,000 feet. So this is a difference. So these units have to be established beforehand, okay, so that we talk the same length and language.
And of course, in a fast jet, it can all be happening very, very quickly.
That is correct. Obviously, when you get these instructions, you're not going to be at Mach 1, okay? So you throttle down, conserve, obviously, the fuel, because you will need all the time then to actually do the run and the whole operation. What else is there to see? And this is what I wanted to say from my own experience, is sometimes what the ground sees is not what the air sees. And that is very impressive, especially if you train with trainees on the ground. That means, okay, so for instance, you will see a white house, which is standing on the street on the right side. And after that, about 1 unit, there's your target. Clear, there's a house and it's white. So, well, in winter time, in snow, all houses are white because you can't see the sides of the houses. You only see the top. So that's what I mean with the dimensions of 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. And that is something that has to be trained, also from the ground and also from the air.
And this was exactly what I was going to ask you about. I mean, it is really important to see the ground with your own eyes from the different flight levels in different times of the year, because it changes.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, these exercises or the operations can only happen if we actually have view to the ground. Otherwise, it does not make sense. There is, of course, ways of operating without visual cues, but that is not the way that this operation should go and will go.
You used the term close air support. Of course, it is a widely known term, but how do you describe it in contemporary modern warfare, where the distances that you can apply your weapons are getting longer? How close actually is the close air support these days?
Well, close air support doesn't mean that I can release a weapon closer or farther away. Close air support means that the fight of the enemy and my own army is very close together, and I need the support very close to my own people. So can I launch or drop a weapon within 5 nautical miles? I probably can. But I have to make sure that I see the target, and I can only do that if I'm at a certain close range. So I hope I answered that question correctly. Close air support means that I have to be close to the fight. I cannot have a standoff weapon that I can launch 50 miles away from the target, because the target will not be something that is standing, okay? But it will be moving because it's the enemy that moves to the left and to the right. That's why you need air support.
So the closeness is between blue and red, not between your aircraft and your blue force. Which brings me to the so-called blue force tracking issue and the importance of it, the importance of a detailed, in this case, land picture, not the air picture.
Yeah, the better you know where your own forces are, the better it is for everyone. I think that is clear. And if I can convey this information into the cockpit, then I have as a pilot, I have a huge gain of, as we say, situational awareness. Then the likelihood of actually having a blue on blue, as we say, so that you actually strike your own troops is smaller and smaller. But in true combat, you might not have that full SA. So you rely on the JTAG telling you exactly what you should be doing.
So who are they actually, the JTAGs? How are they trained? Where do they come from? What is the special quality that they bring to the battlefield?
Well, first of all, I think every nation has their own forward air controllers, the JTAGs, and they are trained obviously in their own nation. Then to get to a certain standard, there is where NATO comes in, and AirCom, which is in the HQ in Ramstein, as far as I know, has the hand on top of the qualification. That means, okay, there are schools that actually do that and they qualify them, saying, okay, so they are teaching according to NATO standards. And then the nation can go ahead and train their own JTAGs. But I think the qualification of this JFAG is actually to think in a 3-dimension. It's like if you have a radar controller from the civilian airline, he looks at his scope and he needs to now put this scope 2D into a 3D picture where he has the aircrafts like on a pearl string, okay, to make sure that he can deconflict them. And I think that 3-dimensional thinking is, I think, valuable for a JTAG.
You said that this exercise includes the forces from all the active EFP battle groups. Is there any Polish contribution to this edition of the exercise?
I had to clarify a little bit that it is the JTAGs that are actually now participating. It's not the EFP battle group.
Right.
It's just like 2 or 3 of the EFP battle group. I think last year we had a Polish contribution, and I think this year as well. But that's a detail that I'm not 100% sure. But normally they are pooled from everywhere. And also not only from the EFP battle groups, but also national contributions are there as well.
And the aircraft contributing, are they from the Baltic air policing missions or are they separately pooled specifically for this exercise?
Well, in the last year, we had the Baltic air policing actually flying those missions. This year, there's a little bit of a mix of both. We will probably see that the Baltic air policing and the enhanced air policing will take 1 or 2 or 3 missions because that's not their primary mission.
This is not exactly air policing. This is air attack.
Not air policing, and it is for sure, if the air policing mission is being attested, okay, everything else falls away. So this is the primary goal of the Baltic air policing and enhanced air policing, that they do police the air. So there were other nations that contributed with aircraft that are also in Šiauliai or in Amari, saying, okay, we will then contribute only to this event of Furious Wolf.
This exercise is commanded and its oversight lies in the Multinational Court Northeast. Even for those people who do follow military affairs, it might be interesting that such a coordination takes place at the level of Corps HQ. Tell me more about this AOCC, which is Air Operations Coordination Center.
First and most of all, we are affiliated with the Corps, so that we are not under a command and control structure. Okay, we are on a functional command of AirCom. That is important because we are, let's say, the right hand of AirCom when it comes to everything that has to do with air. And we, as the AOCC, are the right hand of the commander of the Corps, telling him all that he needs to know about air operations and how he can use the air and how the airspace could be done, and all that the realm of air that he knows and needs to know as a Corps commander. Now, during peacetime, as we are at now, our role is obviously the same way. We relay the commander of AirCom's intention during peacetime to the commander, and we coordinate between the land, as I said already, and like in the Furious Wolf there is, all missions that go with air. It's the link. I get the air support requests. I look at them. Yep. Does it make sense? Are they filled out correctly? Any mistakes? And then I hand these off to AirCom or the CAOC, Command Air Operations Center. And they say, yep, okay, this looks good. And we will go ahead and have the aircrafts fly that. So we are right nested in between, in peacetime right now. In wartime or in crisis, this is a different story. Now we are more pulled into the core, and there's more things to do on the core side for us.
And of course, as probably with every major or new exercise happening in the NATO Eastern Flank, there is this sort of strategic importance of it. How would you describe the significance of such exercise taking place, the air-land coordination, to the degree that you've described just minutes ago, seeing that house and putting your weapons just right after it?
Well, for first of all, we will not drop hot weapons. It's all dry. So no bomb is falling off the aircraft. Okay. So the impact of this exercise is difficult to say. For sure, the training value between the training AFP battle groups and the aircraft has a tremendous impact on both of them. On a way of how it impacts in the area is, for me, hard to say, because there's a lot of exercise going on where there's no air involved. So it's just a normal exercise from, let's say, Estonia or Lithuania or even Poland, and it is not seen. This is a little bit different now, for sure, because there's multinational event. And due to this fact that there's different nations, it gives a little bit of a deterrence effect to this. And I think that's something that the higher leadership is looking for.
Let me ask a final question, asking you for a personal reflection with your vast experience as a German Air Force pilot and officer about the transformation and the direction where the European NATO air forces are headed. Some nations, as we know, are investing in a fifth generation capability, including Poland and some other nations in the Baltic Sea region. Some other nations are thinking about major upgrades in their air forces. How do you see the future of the European leg of NATO allied air force, also in terms of close air support?
I think that the systems are evolving. That's a fact. And if I look further into the future, we might even see that there will be less and less manned aircraft and more UAVs and unmanned aircraft and vehicles, also in the realm of close air support. But the important thing is to remember is an eye that is right there and feels the threat, because the man is sitting in the cockpit, is a different way of dealing with the problem than somebody sitting further away on a console. That's two different things. Going from the generations that we have now to the fifth generation will for sure have a lot of positive developments. What exactly are going to be in the close air support region is difficult to say, because we still need to have the communication and we still need to bring the bomb or the weapon into the target. And that can be done with a Cessna, basically, or it can be done with an F-35. To what extent and how good? Now, I think we both can agree that the 35 is better than the Cessna.
Lieutenant Colonel Andreas Kaukel, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
W tej edycji podcastu obronnego Polityki Insight to już wszystko. Zapraszam na kolejne wydanie za około miesiąc. Marek Świerczyński, do usłyszenia.